My name is Dave Schultz, and I'm an athletic trainer here at the Nebraska Orthopedic and Sports Medicine, and I'm here today to talk about prevention of dehydration and dealing with heat illness. First thing I want to do is make the distinction between heat illness and dehydration. Dehydration is essentially the loss of fluids from the body that exceed that which is taken in, while heat illness is the inability of the body to cool itself sufficiently due to either heat stress, lack of sufficient fluids in the body for sweating to cool itself, or some other form of electrolyte imbalance. So you can be dehydrated in the Arctic. It's just a matter of not taking in fluids, while heat illness is always associated with a heat element, being hot in a hot environment, and it is compounded by the fact that the person may be dehydrated, but you can still suffer heat illness while being sufficiently hydrated. It's just the fact that you're going through an intense activity in a very hot environment. The body's inability to cool itself in that situation can be very much a problem for when you're outside, particularly working with athletes. But dehydration can happen to anybody, any time of year, any sport, indoors or outdoors. Like I said, there's a factor of the individual taking in sufficient fluids. We expel fluids through different measures. But as far as dehydration goes, why we're concerned with it is that it's very important to the overall health and well-being of your athletes, as well as this, overall safety. You've got to be fully hydrated as a preventive measure for heat illness, but it's also very important that we have sufficient fluids in it just for normal bodily functions. Most importantly for a coach in athletic activities is that just being mildly dehydrated can affect performance significantly. Mildly dehydrated amounts to about 2% of a person's body weight. So for a 150-pound person, that's about 3 pounds of loss through sweat primarily, and that significantly affects performance, and they just don't have the endurance and the ability to go out what they would normally be able to do if they were fully hydrated. So it has a huge effect on performance. So what causes dehydration? Well, there's two factors. It's input, fluid input, as well as fluid output. So primarily when we're dealing with athletes, we're talking about sweating. Although most of our fluid is lost through elimination and urination. We also lose about a pint of fluid a day in just normal respiration. But largely the sweating mechanism for the body is a way to cool itself. As the body generates heat, takes in heat from the environment, the heat is lost through the evaporative process of sweat, and along with that goes sodium and salt and other electrolyte minerals. So there, the person needs to be able to rehydrate by taking in fluid, as well as not only before athletic activity, but as well as during, and replenishing himself, rehydrating afterwards. So it's important that we understand the degree of dehydration is really dependent on what kind of environment, how intensive of an activity, how long of activity, as well as what we take in. Those are factors that you will have to address with your athletes. It's hard to tell sometimes if someone is becoming dehydrated. The more mildly dehydrated people, it's really difficult to tell. But as they become more dehydrated, there's a lot of problems that will start emanating from a person. They'll be much more fatigued, extremely fatigued. They'll feel weak, they'll have a headache. Obviously they're profusely sweating. You'll see a decrease in their performance, not able to get up and down the field or the court. And another factor that we'll check on is the color of their urine and how often they are urinating each day. They should be urinating several times a day, not only typically upon waking in the morning, but 2 or 3 times throughout the day. If they aren't, they're dehydrated. Another thing that's important, you need to be sure that your athletes understand that they shouldn't wait until they're thirsty to drink during the athletic activity. It's important that during the athletic activity that we take in just small cups, juice cup size amounts of fluid every 15-20 minutes or so throughout the athletic activity. As I mentioned before, even 2% of body loss can represent a level of dehydration. 100-pound athlete, that's 2 pounds. 150-pound athletes, that's about 3 pounds. 200-pound athlete, that's 4 pounds. When people exceed 3% of their body weight, that's an indication that they really should not go out. They're very, very susceptible to heat illness, and other more severe dehydration problems. So in a 130-pound athlete, that represents about 4 pounds, up to 4 pounds of fluid loss over the course of an athletic period. So what we'll do with athletes, particularly during the hot season, particularly August, but starting in July and August and on into first part of September, very often we will weigh people prior to practice as well as afterwards, and we'll monitor the extent of their weight loss through, and most of that is almost all water weight through sweat loss. So a 130-pound person can easily lose 4 pounds of bodily fluid. 2 pounds of water weight is actually equal to about a quart. So if a person loses 4 pounds, that person is actually having to replace a half a gallon of fluid before they really should be out there again. And so that's where we get this problem with dehydration. It's usually an accumulation over several days or even a week, where they might be replacing fluids, but they aren't replacing fluids sufficiently enough. So for every pound of body weight that's lost, a person needs to take in about 16 ounces. As far as preventing dehydration, what we typically recommend for people prior to the event, about an hour or so, depending on the age, a range of about 16 to 24 ounces. Younger athletes, you can go on the lower end of that. The older, more experienced athletes can take on the higher end of that, but about 16 to 24 ounces of fluid an hour before. During the athletic event, they should be taking in about 4 to 8 ounces of fluid every 15-20 minutes. And again, that's about a juice cup size amount of fluid on a regular basis. And we also recommend that after the athletic event that they might incorporate some type of sports drink. And I think there's no better sports drink out there than Gatorade. And that's mainly because sports drinks also usually contain some of these electrolytes, particularly that of sodium, and but also noting that they're also high in carbs, which is largely a sugar content. So activities that certainly exceed 1.5 hours, 2 hours, typically we recommend that there's some level of supplementation and not just pure water. So that's important to understand. I want to be careful in this next statement is that we want to be sure that we don't drive this so much in athletes that they excessively overdrink or take in fluids. That can actually be dangerous. We see that more in elite athletes, but it's important that we don't take in too much water and you're really forcing water into people because that actually can throw off this balance of fluids and electrolytes of sodium. So if we've sweat out so much water and sodium and we only replace water, we start to dilute the body, and that imbalance can cause a lot of serious problems. So we have to be careful that we don't force it on them. At the same time, it's critical that they do get the fluids and replace those fluids after practices. Another thing that we monitor, again, I mentioned earlier, is urine output. Typically, with the exception of that first urination there in the mornings, we want the urine to be fairly clear, or what they describe very often is more of a lighter color, lemonade color, as opposed to an apple juice type color, a darker color. The darker the color, the less hydrated or more dehydrated you are. So they should be going fairly frequently, at least 2 or 3 times a day. Very often we'll find people that run into problems during an athletic event. They start cramping up and they develop problems with dehydration, and we'll ask them, when's the last time they urinated, and they'll say, well, this morning. Well, we're 8 hours afterwards and they haven't. So that is an issue. So we want to make sure that they're going frequently and that their urine is clear, particularly during these very hot periods. I think it's important that we allow unlimited access to water on the fields and the courts. Where these kids can take in fluid throughout the athletic event. We should not be restricted, should be easily accessible. As far as heat illness, again, heat illness is through heat stress, through hot environment, as well as humid environment, where it makes the sweating process a little more difficult. It takes usually up about 2 weeks to acclimatize to working outside. You'll be working with a lot of athletes that come from different lifestyle, social settings. Like myself, I work inside an air-conditioned room behind a computer most of the day, and then if I do some work outside, I am much more susceptible to heat illness as opposed to those that are outside mowing lawns and working outside all day, and they're much less susceptible. So there is a acclimatization period that takes up to about 2 weeks, So at the preseason, we need to make sure that we are progressively working up into a hot environment in terms of time and intensity. We do have to constantly reinforce with these kids to rehydrate and to take those preventive measures, fluids before, during, and afterwards. Particularly in the hot periods when it's possible. We don't wear real tall socks, put the socks down. That's difficult with the soccer players with the shin guards, but certainly allowing the shirts to be more open and shorter sleeves, and not wearing anything on the head and headbands and things like that. So we make sure that we're wearing the appropriate equipment and clothing. I think you need to instill in your athletes that they need to watch over each other. We know that you as coaches are going to take best to heart their health and well-being and watch over them as closely as possible. It's not very often that during practice and games that you have medical staff present, but so I think it's important that you instill in your athletes that they help each other out and watch over and take care of each other. So another point to make is that those athletes that are at highest risk of heat illnesses are those people with prior history. So you have to know your athlete's prior history of heat illnesses. They're much more susceptible once they go through a bout of heat exhaustion, or hopefully not heat stroke type of conditions. So those that are unconditioned, that they haven't been out, they haven't gone out for a sport, they haven't been doing anything for the last 2 or 3 months exertionally. And youth are just much more susceptible to heat illness than adults are. Obviously, the people that are obese have a harder time cooling, and then also those people that are coming off any kind of illnesses, gastrointestinal or respiratory illnesses, are more susceptible to heat illness because they can't cool themselves as well. This is a chart. It's fairly easy to access on the internet. It's a heat index chart. Heat index is a correlation between relative humidity and temperature. For the most part, when we get up around 100, certainly 100 to 103, that's probably a limit that a person needs to be aware of when persons needs to start taking particularly more extreme precautions for heat illness. In the mornings in Lincoln, the humidity is typically in the lower 80s. A lot of people think that because the temperature is typically lower in the mornings, it's a little safer. It might be better to go out and get practices in. But as you can see on this chart, if in the mornings, if we have a relative humidity of, say, 80%, you reach that extreme heat index at 88 degrees. And we've had people across the United States every year, we lose kids due to heat illness. And a lot of times it's due to being out, not understanding this concept of the heat index and exceeding that. So you can be practicing outside in the mornings, a very hot morning that's say 90, 92 degrees, and actually have a heat index of 113, 121. Those are astronomical conditions for people to be outside. So you need to understand that concept that even though it's only 86, 88, 90 degrees, although that is warm, those can be very extreme circumstances for some athletes. In the afternoons, our humidity is typically up around the upper 50s, so we start to exceed that limit on heat index right around 94 degrees, and very often, almost every day, it's going to reach the low 90s to mid 90s. So we're constantly in this period where we need to take extreme caution, make sure we're very aware of that. So you need to understand this heat index chart, and you can Google these on the internet and just type in heat index charts, and so you have a better understanding. Like anything else, there's varying levels of severity over particular conditions, and particularly that with heat illnesses. Initially, people that start running into heat illness will start, one of the first signs that they'll be cramping up. We see that a lot. People that are out running around, they start cramping up in the calves. Then it proceeds to the upper thigh muscles, the quads, and the hamstrings. With heat cramps, typically that's just strictly due to the lack of sufficient fluids. They're typically dehydrated. Very often we'll see that they have a very large loss of salt, sodium, due to this accumulated effect. And they're usually out going through very high intense activities. During the week, we don't see many kids at practices cramping up, but Friday night football games, we have all these kids that are cramping up. Well, it's just because the intensity at these activities at practices aren't near as high as they are during games, so That's why we tend to see this. For that, you need to get fluids in them. Particularly, this would be another situation where you could use a sports drink where they can help get that sodium in. These people need to get a little bit more sodium in them, although you need to use precaution for those kids that are hypertensive, high blood pressure, or have any other kind of condition where they are on a salt-restricted diet. So you have to be careful. You can't paint your whole team that you may have an athlete or two that have some of those, so you have to be careful what you tell these kids. But typically, a vast majority of kids is due to lower sodium. They're out there playing very frequently and very often throughout the course of a week during a season. Typically, you have to have a little bit more of a supplemented diet with sodium salt. Start to get into some more serious problems. These heat exhaustion, and heat exhaustion itself is typically not considered an emergency, but if we don't address it appropriately, it can easily go quickly into heat stroke, which is a medical emergency. And that's what these kids, when we lose kids, you hear about losing kids across the nation, particularly that of football. It's heat stroke is what happens with these kids, and they all start off with some level of heat exhaustion that proceeds on into more of a serious condition. So with heat exhaustion, a person is a lot more pale, ashen skin. They're typically usually sweating pretty heavily. They usually have a very rapid but weak pulse. Usually they feel very weak, and they're very fatigued. They just can't do much, even walking up a flight of stairs. They usually have some nausea and maybe even be vomiting to some extent, and typically hit a headache. These people have to be removed from the athletic activity. They need to be placed in a cooler environment, getting them in the shade, loosening their clothes, allowing more air access to the body so they can help cool the body. You can facilitate that by putting cold packs on various parts of the body, typically armpits and along the trunk and groin area. Help cool the body, getting them, fanning them, and starting to replace those fluids. Typically they'll settle down. If they continue to get worse, then we were a lot more concerned about developing heat stroke. This condition is an emergency. The first step in dealing with this, you need to be able to recognize it. Typically, you're not going to know what their internal body temperature is, but these people with heat stroke have body temperatures up above 140 degrees. Their skin is very flushed and hot to the touch. They have a very high heart rate. Their blood pressure is depressed and down. They have a very high respiration rate. They're very faint. They're dizzy. They're going to be nauseated as well as vomiting. They're confused, disoriented. They can even become combative because they don't know what's going on around them and eventually collapse and become unconscious. Obviously, we have to enact EMS, but first things first is that you have to do anything you can to get this person cooled off now. And that typically involves some kind of cold water immersion, and that even sticking them in an ice bath. You may have to get a vinyl tarp of some sort, dump a cooler water in it, place them in any kind of cold bath. Prior to transporting them, you have to get that person cooled down right now, because the time it takes for an ambulance to get there and get to the hospital, get attended to, may be too late. So that's the first thing to understand with heat stroke, that someone that kind of goes unconscious or is really out of it, very hot and very unresponsive. That's all I have for today, and I look forward to seeing you at the coaches clinic. Thank you.